In the spring of 1945, a quiet German town slept under the shadow of the Third Reich, unaware that everything they had known was about to vanish overnight. Families went to bed as usual, children dreaming of summer fields and schoolyard games, while parents worried quietly about shortages, air raids, and the endless calls for loyalty to a collapsing regime. The streets were familiar, lined with old cobblestones, shuttered shops, and the occasional propaganda poster that seemed more like a relic than a warning. Yet as the night deepened, an almost unimaginable event began to unfold. When dawn broke, it revealed a scene that defied belief. Sherman tanks, steel hulks of the American Army, were parked at the edges of streets that had seemed safe only hours before. Their barrels glinted in the morning light, and their engines hummed quietly as soldiers moved with practiced precision. Civilians rubbed their eyes, unsure if what they saw was real. Entire neighborhoods were suddenly under foreign control, yet there had been no warning, no announcement over radio or loudspeaker, just silence, and then the undeniable presence of armored men and machines. Some townspeople emerged cautiously from their homes, faces pale with shock. Mothers clutched their children, whispering reassurances even as their own hearts raced. Elderly citizens shook their heads in disbelief, remembering the years of propaganda that had promised German invincibility. Shopkeepers froze in doorways, their morning routines interrupted by soldiers quietly taking control of intersections, marking the invisible boundaries of this new authority. In some houses, white flags were hastily hung from windows, a desperate plea for mercy and a signal of surrender. The symbolism was clear. The war was no longer a distant threat. It was here, and it had arrived with unprecedented speed. Civilians watched the soldiers with a mixture of fear, relief, and awe. Many had heard rumors of Patton's Third Army moving rapidly across the countryside, but no one had imagined they could appear so suddenly, without artillery barrages or weeks of occupation. For children, the sight of these massive tanks rolling silently down the streets was terrifying and mesmerizing, as if a scene from a storybook had come to life with real consequences. Meanwhile, adults tried to understand the implications. Who would take responsibility for the town? How long would the occupation last? And what would happen to those who had been part of the Nazi apparatus? Across the town square, abandoned bicycles lay in disarray, and market stalls stood empty, frozen mid-motion, as if the entire town had been paused. The usual sounds of daily life, the clatter of shoes on cobblestones, the hum of conversation, were replaced by the mechanical rhythm of armored vehicles and the quiet commands of soldiers. It was as though the town had been transported into a new reality, one where the rules had changed and survival depended on navigating this sudden, overwhelming presence. In homes and cellars, people whispered anxiously, sharing fragmented information. Some had heard that German units nearby had already surrendered, while others spoke of fierce resistance crumbling under the weight of the American advance. The psychological impact was profound. The sudden arrival of tanks did more than secure territory. It shattered routines, upturned expectations, and forced ordinary people to confront a truth they had long denied. The Third Reich was collapsing, and there was no going back. Even as civilians tried to adjust, soldiers began their work with efficiency and discipline. Streets were patrolled, checkpoints established, and the local landscape of power rewritten in hours. While some townspeople saw the Americans as liberators, others feared looting, reprisals, or forced displacement. Families began to take stock of what they had, securing valuables and marking safe spaces, knowing that each hour of occupation could bring a new, unpredictable challenge. The once familiar streets felt alien, the rooftops and church steeples witnesses to a sudden and irreversible change. The scale of the surprise was astonishing. Across Germany, entire regions experienced similar moments of shock. Towns awakening to the presence of enemy forces, soldiers appearing where no one expected them, and civilians forced to reconcile years of indoctrination with a new reality. In this particular town, the memory of that morning would endure for generations, the sudden intrusion of history into everyday life, a reminder of the fragility of order and the swift consequences of a war finally reaching the heart of the nation. By mid-morning, some semblance of routine began to emerge, but the atmosphere remained tense. Children peeked from behind curtains, curious but cautious, while adults attempted to communicate with soldiers, seeking answers about food, safety, and the future. Word spread quickly as neighbors whispered of similar events in nearby towns, painting a picture of an unstoppable advance. The realization sank in. The war was not being fought in distant fields anymore. It had arrived in their streets, their homes, and their consciousness. The sudden arrival of tanks was more than a military maneuver. It was a psychological shockwave, one that left civilians questioning their past decisions, their loyalties, and the stories they had been told. It was the beginning of a new chapter, not only for the town, but for all of Germany, a chapter defined by occupation, surrender, and the painstaking process of coming to terms with a world that had been rewritten overnight. In those first hours, ordinary people were witnesses to history, standing at the intersection of fear, relief, and the dawn of a new era. By early March 1945, the Allied forces were poised to strike at the heart of Germany. The war had dragged on for nearly 6 years, leaving destruction and fear across the continent. Western Germany remained one of the last major strongholds of the Third Reich, and the Rhine River, Germany's legendary natural barrier, had long been considered an almost insurmountable obstacle to any invading force. For decades it had symbolized security and strength, yet the Americans were determined to cross it, and the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen became the focal point of one of the most audacious maneuvers in the final months of World War II. The town of Remagen, small and unassuming, had gone about its daily life under the shadow of the Reich. Civilians were accustomed to curfews, rationing, and the occasional air raid, but few had imagined that their town would soon become a flashpoint in history. On the morning of March 7, 1945, a unique combination of circumstance and daring led to an event that would shock both German defenders and Allied strategists. The Ludendorff Bridge, spanning the Rhine, was meant to be destroyed to prevent an Allied crossing. Its demolition was delayed and partially unsuccessful. This oversight presented an unprecedented opportunity, an intact bridge over a river that had been a natural barrier for centuries. American forces, moving rapidly in a campaign that emphasized speed and surprise, seized upon the opening with a mixture of boldness and urgency. Engineers, infantry, and armored units coordinated a crossing that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. Sherman tanks rolled across the bridge, their treads clanking against the steel, while soldiers followed in a steady stream, weapons at the ready. Behind them, artillery units prepared to provide cover, and paratroopers were poised to secure the surrounding areas. Every moment was charged with tension. A misstep could result in disaster, collapsing the bridge or leaving troops exposed to German fire. Meanwhile, German defenders were scrambling to respond. Orders were rushed, communication lines were fragmented, and panic spread among the ranks. The bridge, a critical defensive position, had been partially rigged for demolition, but the timing was off. Explosions were attempted, but the steel structure held firm. Soldiers who had trained for weeks to repel an invasion found themselves powerless as waves of American troops and vehicles crossed the Rhine, establishing a foothold on the eastern bank. The scale of the operation was staggering, Within hours, what should have been an impenetrable barrier had become a conduit for thousands of enemy soldiers. Civilians in Remagen and nearby towns watched the events unfold with disbelief. From the windows of their homes, they could see Sherman tanks maneuvering across the bridge, the disciplined march of infantry, and the organized chaos of supply trucks moving steadily behind the front lines. Some hid in cellars, terrified of stray gunfire or artillery shells, while others ventured cautiously into the streets, trying to understand what had just happened. Families whispered urgently, sharing rumors of German officers fleeing, of orders ignored, and of the shocking efficiency of the Americans. Children clung to parents, uncertain whether the strange olive-drab soldiers were a threat or a strange promise of liberation. The crossing at Remagen was not merely a military operation, it was a psychological blow to the Germans. The Rhine had been considered a final line of defense, and its sudden breach sent shockwaves through both the army and the civilian population. For ordinary people, it was another example of how quickly the war was collapsing around them. Towns that had felt insulated suddenly became front lines, and the notion of safety, however fragile, vanished almost overnight. The presence of tanks and infantry moving so rapidly across German soil was proof that the Allied advance could no longer be resisted with conventional defenses. Within days, the Americans had established a secure bridgehead on the eastern bank, allowing additional forces to cross and extend their reach deeper into Germany. Patton's Third Army, already advancing rapidly from the west, coordinated with units moving from the north and south, creating a web of control that encircled key German positions. Supplies, artillery, and reinforcements flowed steadily across the Ludendorff Bridge, while German forces struggled to regroup. The combination of tactical brilliance, speed, and sheer audacity made the Rhine crossing at Remagen one of the pivotal moments of the closing months of the war. In the town itself, the presence of American soldiers quickly transformed daily life. Houses were commandeered for command posts, roads became supply routes, and civilians were forced to adapt to a new reality. Some townspeople attempted to continue their routines, going to small shops or collecting food, while others simply observed, unable to process the sudden influx of foreign troops in their streets. Conversations were hushed, questions were exchanged in whispers, and the fear of reprisals lingered in every alley. Yet, amidst the tension, there were glimpses of relief. Many civilians recognized that the arrival of American forces meant the imminent end of Nazi rule. The oppressive structures of control that had defined life for years were crumbling. The Ludendorff Bridge itself became a symbol of both opportunity and peril. American engineers worked tirelessly to maintain its stability, aware that German attempts to destroy it could come at any moment. Artillery bombardments, sabotage attempts, and airstrikes all posed threats to the precarious lifeline that connected forces on both sides of the river. Yet the bridge held, allowing for the rapid movement of troops and equipment that would accelerate the Allied advance into central Germany. Soldiers who crossed it often remarked on the surreal experience of moving from one side of a centuries-old river to the other, knowing that each step brought them closer to ending the war. Civilians who witnessed these events would remember them vividly for the rest of their lives. The sight of tanks rumbling across an intact bridge, soldiers moving with calculated precision, and the sudden collapse of what had seemed like a formidable barrier became an indelible memory. The crossing at Remagen was more than a tactical maneuver. It was a turning point that demonstrated the futility of German resistance in the West. It revealed the effectiveness of coordinated strategy, the importance of speed and surprise, and the human capacity to adapt in the face of sudden change. By the end of the first day, the town had transformed entirely. Streets once quiet and familiar were now filled with vehicles, soldiers, and the hum of military activity. Civilians adjusted as best they could, marking safe areas, seeking news of the broader situation, and processing the reality that their homeland was being occupied in real time. The psychological impact of the crossing echoed far beyond Remagen. German commanders across the region were forced to reconsider defensive positions, while ordinary citizens came to terms with the fact that the war was no longer distant, it was at their doorsteps.
By March 1945, Patton's Third Army was moving with a momentum that seemed unstoppable, sweeping across central Germany at a pace that confounded both civilians and German forces. The months of careful planning, intelligence gathering, and relentless training had culminated in a strategy built on speed, surprise, and aggression. What had once seemed impossible, penetrating deep into the heart of Germany while maintaining supply lines, morale, and operational control, was now unfolding in real time. Towns that had felt insulated from the front lines were suddenly waking up to the rumble of armored vehicles, the clatter of soldiers' boots, and the surreal presence of Americans in streets once dominated by swastikas and propaganda banners. For the soldiers themselves, every day was a mixture of discipline, exhaustion, and exhilaration. Tanks moved in coordinated columns, infantry followed in formation, and reconnaissance units scouted ahead to prevent ambushes or traps. Patton demanded speed, and his officers pushed troops relentlessly. Maps were studied over briefings in commandeered farmhouses or small municipal halls, and orders were transmitted with urgency across radio networks. Soldiers spoke little, conserving energy, scanning the horizon for threats, yet each one carried the knowledge that they were part of a historic campaign, one that could end the war within weeks if the momentum held. German defenses, meanwhile, were crumbling under the pressure. Communication lines had been severed, units were disoriented, and morale was at an all-time low. Many soldiers had already witnessed the fall of towns to the Americans and understood that the Third Reich's grip was slipping. Some attempted desperate counterattacks, others surrendered at the first sight of advancing columns. Towns along the route were caught between retreating German forces and the incoming Americans, creating a tense liminal space where civilians had to navigate uncertainty and fear. The civilian experience during Patton's advance was surreal. Ordinary citizens who had endured years of rationing, propaganda, and war fatigue suddenly found themselves face to face with an army that moved faster than they could comprehend. Streets were filled with tanks, jeeps, and trucks, their engines producing a constant roar. Soldiers patrolled, set up checkpoints, and secured bridges and crossroads. People peeked from windows, cautiously venturing into alleyways, and whispered urgently about the news they had heard. Entire cities had fallen overnight, Nazi officials were fleeing, and surrender seemed inevitable. Children clutched parents' hands, while elders tried to piece together how the war could reach them so quickly after years of seeming stability. The psychological impact of such rapid advances cannot be overstated. For many German civilians, it was as though the ground itself was shifting beneath their feet. Towns that had felt secure one night were occupied by the next morning. Shops and homes were suddenly in the hands of foreigners, and the symbols of a crumbling regime, flags, posters, and monuments were defaced or removed. The abruptness of the occupation created a mixture of fear and relief. On one hand, the unknown threat of war lingered. On the other, the presence of American forces signaled the imminent end of Nazi rule. Civilians experienced a strange duality, terror at the invasion and cautious hope that their suffering might soon conclude. Patton's strategy relied not only on speed, but also on unpredictability. Units moved along multiple axes, bypassing fortified towns when necessary, and striking targets with precision before German forces could regroup. Supply lines were stretched to the limit, yet the Army's logistical planners ensured fuel, ammunition, and rations reached the front lines. This relentless pace forced German commanders to make impossible decisions: defend key positions at the risk of encirclement or retreat and hope to regroup further east. Many chose the latter, abandoning towns, bridges, and artillery pieces as they fled. The Third Army's advance was a psychological weapon as much as a military one, demonstrating that resistance was futile and that surrender was increasingly the only viable option. As columns of tanks and infantry moved through towns, civilians were forced to navigate a landscape of uncertainty. Some attempted to communicate with soldiers, offering food or information in exchange for protection. Others tried to avoid contact entirely, hiding in basements or attics, fearing looting or reprisal. The presence of so many armed men created both a sense of order and chaos simultaneously. Daily routines were disrupted, markets were closed, schools emptied, and farms left unattended. Families were forced to make rapid decisions about safety, often relying on luck or intuition as the line between survival and danger blurred. Despite the speed of the advance, Patton insisted on maintaining discipline and preventing unnecessary destruction. Soldiers were ordered to respect civilian property when possible, though chaos and miscommunication sometimes led to accidents or misunderstandings. Civilians noted the contrast between the ruthlessness of German propaganda and the pragmatic professionalism of the advancing Americans. In many towns, they observed a mixture of awe and gratitude, even amidst fear, as the invading soldiers represented the end of oppression and a new, uncertain future. The march through central Germany also revealed the logistical genius behind the operation. Engineers repaired bridges, cleared roads of debris, and established forward supply depots with incredible efficiency. Medical units treated the wounded, both soldiers and civilians, while reconnaissance teams mapped enemy positions and potential hazards. Each element of the army functioned as part of a coordinated machine, demonstrating the power of meticulous planning combined with audacious execution. For civilians witnessing these movements, it was as though an unstoppable force was moving through their towns, reshaping the landscape and the course of history with every passing hour. Encounters between American soldiers and German civilians were often tense but instructive. Some townspeople offered guidance, pointing out hidden dangers or explaining local terrain. Others confronted soldiers angrily, fearful of occupation or uncertain of the invaders' intentions. In some instances, children followed columns of soldiers, fascinated by the sheer scale of the operation. Women carried baskets of food to command posts, trying to maintain a semblance of normal life. Across every street, alley, and square, civilians were forced to adapt quickly, their daily existence reframed by the presence of an army moving faster than they had thought possible. Patton's relentless advance also had a cascading effect on German forces further east. News of towns falling overnight, entire units surrendering without resistance, and the speed of the American approach demoralized defenders. Radio broadcasts, leaflets, and rumors painted a picture of inevitability. The Third Reich was collapsing, and the Third Army's momentum was unstoppable. For civilians, this was both terrifying and strangely reassuring. They understood that the American forces were approaching with overwhelming strength, yet with each passing day, the hope of survival increased. By the time the Third Army had crossed central Germany, the cumulative effects of speed, surprise, and psychological pressure were evident. Towns were occupied, key transport routes were under control, and German defenses were increasingly fractured. Civilians, while still fearful, began to recognize that the war's end was near. Streets that had once been quiet under Nazi rule were now vibrant with the movement of soldiers, supplies, and liberated civilians. The landscape of central Germany had been transformed in mere days, a testament to the audacity and effectiveness of Patton's strategy. The advance of Patton's Third Army in March and April 1945 was more than a military campaign. It was a demonstration of the impact of speed, surprise, and morale on both enemy forces and civilians. Towns that had been under Nazi control for years were suddenly confronted with a new reality, foreign troops moving with relentless purpose, reshaping the world around them in a matter of hours. For ordinary citizens, the experience was surreal, moments of fear, awe, and hope intertwined as history unfolded directly before their eyes. The Third Army's march through central Germany was a vivid illustration of the power of strategy, coordination, and audacity, and its effects would resonate long after the war ended. By the end of this relentless campaign, Patton's forces had not only secured territory, but also undermined the psychological cohesion of the German army and civilian population. The speed of the advance, the precision of operations, and the sheer audacity of moving through central Germany so rapidly left an indelible mark on those who witnessed it. For civilians, it was a lesson in the suddenness with which life could change, the fragility of control, and the astonishing speed with which history could arrive in their streets. In these days, ordinary Germans watched the collapse of a regime and the unstoppable advance of an army that seemed to be everywhere at once, rewriting the course of their lives and the fate of their nation.
By early April 1945, the Allied forces had pushed deep into Germany, and the Ruhr region, the industrial heart of the nation, had become the focal point of one of the final battles on the Western Front. The area was heavily fortified, with thousands of German soldiers preparing to resist, yet the speed and coordination of the Allied advance left them trapped. Encirclement was inevitable, and civilians in towns across the region braced for the unknown. For families living in the Ruhr, life had already been tense for years under war. Factories operated under duress, rationing was strict, and air raid alarms were a constant reminder of danger. Now, with American and Allied forces closing in, civilians watched as the familiar streets transformed overnight. Vehicles, armored units, and marching soldiers moved with precision, while German troops attempted last-ditch defenses or retreat. The sheer scale of the movement left townspeople in disbelief. German soldiers faced a nightmare scenario. Surrounded on all sides, cut off from supplies and reinforcements, many realized resistance was futile. Some tried desperate breakouts, others surrendered immediately, lowering weapons with a mix of exhaustion, fear, and resignation. Within hours, the collapse of organized defense became clear. Over 317,000 German soldiers would eventually surrender in the Ruhr pocket, making it one of the largest mass capitulations of the war. Civilians witnessed scenes that would stay with them forever. Streets once filled with workers and children became crowded with surrendering soldiers, supply trucks, and patrols. Families hid in cellars or cautiously observed from windows, placing white flags on their homes to signal non-resistance. The sudden shift in control was both terrifying and strangely relieving. For many, the presence of Allied troops meant the immediate danger of combat had passed and the oppressive grip of the Nazi regime was breaking. The surrender was a logistical challenge for the Allies. Troops had to manage thousands of prisoners, secure towns, and maintain supply lines while minimizing violence. Soldiers patrolled streets, organized assembly points for captives, and coordinated transport efficiently. Civilians began to venture out more confidently, observing operations and cautiously resuming routines. The contrast between the chaos of surrender and the discipline of the occupying forces was striking. Psychologically, the mass surrender shattered long-held beliefs. German civilians had been taught that resistance was a duty and that surrender was dishonorable. Seeing entire units capitulate in organized fashion forced people to confront the reality that the war was over for many soldiers and that the Reich's power was crumbling. For some, relief mixed with fear and uncertainty. For others, it was a moment of dawning hope that survival was possible. Families assessed their homes, retrieved supplies, and tried to adjust to the new authority now present in their streets. The Ruhr pocket also marked a turning point militarily. The Allies secured a critical industrial region, neutralized thousands of German troops, and demonstrated the futility of further resistance in Western Germany. Civilians were now witnesses to both the end of German military control and the arrival of occupation. Markets reopened, soldiers interacted cautiously with townspeople, and daily life slowly began to resume amid the presence of Allied authority. The rapid collapse of German forces reinforced the psychological reality: the war was nearing its end. By the time the Ruhr pocket had been fully secured, civilians understood that life had irrevocably changed. Streets once dominated by fear and propaganda were now controlled by foreign soldiers, and the immediate threat of combat had diminished. Families cautiously ventured outside, assessing damages, reconnecting with neighbors, and trying to restore some sense of normalcy. The surrender had not only neutralized enemy forces, but had also reshaped the social and psychological landscape of the region.
For townspeople, the surrender of the Ruhr Pocket symbolized both an end and a beginning. The oppressive machinery of the Third Reich had been dismantled in a matter of hours, leaving civilians to navigate the new reality of occupation, adaptation, and recovery. Witnessing such a large-scale surrender, seeing the collapse of military resistance, and realizing that the war was reaching its final chapters left a lasting impression. The events in the Ruhr would remain a vivid memory of both fear and relief, a testament to the power of strategy, coordination, and the sudden, transformative impact of history unfolding directly in their streets.
As April 1945 progressed, the war that had dominated German life for 6 long years was drawing to a chaotic, sudden close. For ordinary civilians, the rapid collapse of the Third Reich was both terrifying and disorienting. Towns that had once seemed secure were now occupied by Allied forces. Streets that had been silent under Nazi control were filled with the rumble of tanks and marching soldiers, and familiar routines, work, school, shopping, were abruptly disrupted. Families who had lived under strict curfews and propaganda found themselves confronting a reality they could hardly have imagined. In homes and cellars, civilians whispered anxiously, sharing fragments of information. Some had heard that neighboring towns had been overtaken without a fight, that German soldiers were surrendering in droves, and that the once mighty army was now retreating or captured. Children clung to parents, unable to comprehend the scale of change, while adults tried to piece together what the future might hold. Each morning brought new uncertainty. Would soldiers arrive at their door? Would the town be safe? Were there mines, snipers, or other hidden dangers? The sudden occupation transformed daily life. Streets once lined with markets and shops were now controlled by checkpoints and patrols. Many homes were requisitioned for command posts, while schools and factories remained closed or repurposed. Civilians had to navigate a fragile balance, venturing out to find food or supplies while avoiding conflict, observing curfews, and adapting to the new authority of foreign soldiers. For some, the Americans represented liberation; for others, an unfamiliar and unpredictable force. Families learned quickly that survival depended on observation, caution, and sometimes sheer luck. Fear was constant, but so was curiosity. Children peeked through windows to watch Sherman tanks maneuver, soldiers patrol, or columns of prisoners march through town. Adults, meanwhile, assessed risks and sought to establish contact with the occupiers, sometimes offering food or local guidance in exchange for safety. Stories of surrender and occupation spread quickly, carried by word of mouth, giving civilians a sense of the broader collapse unfolding across Germany. What had once seemed distant, enemy troops advancing, entire armies surrendering, was now happening in their streets, neighborhoods, and homes. The psychological impact was profound. Generations had been raised with the ideology of the Third Reich, taught that loyalty was sacred and surrender dishonorable. Yet now civilians witnessed soldiers laying down their arms, Nazi officials fleeing, and the collapse of structures that had defined their lives. Relief and fear coexisted. Relief that the fighting was ending, fear of the unknown that lay ahead. Families had to make quick decisions, whether to remain in their homes, flee to safer areas, or interact cautiously with occupying soldiers. Every choice carried weight, and the consequences of mistakes could be severe. In many towns, small acts of humanity emerged amid the uncertainty. Soldiers provided basic assistance to civilians, food, water, medical care, while some townspeople offered guidance, pointing out hazards or sharing news. Children, initially frightened, began to recognize patterns in the soldiers' behavior, understanding that they were more orderly and disciplined than feared. These interactions, brief as they might be, offered glimpses of normalcy in a world that had been upended. Civilians began to adapt, learning to live alongside the occupying forces, even as the shadow of recent violence lingered. Yet survival was not just physical, it was psychological. Families had to reconcile years of indoctrination with the new reality. The symbols of the Nazi regime, flags, posters, monuments, were removed or defaced,
leaving streets and buildings stark and unfamiliar. Citizens wrestled with guilt, relief, and uncertainty. Guilt for what they had endured or failed to resist, relief that the end of oppression was near, and uncertainty about what life under Allied occupation would look like. Daily routines were reshaped, food shortages persisted, housing had been damaged, and communication was limited. But townspeople found ways to navigate the new order. The collapse of Nazi control also created moments of improvisation and resilience. Some families hosted displaced neighbors or refugees fleeing from other towns. Community members shared scarce resources, repaired damaged homes, and restored basic services. People learned quickly to adjust to curfews and regulations imposed by the occupying forces, while also trying to maintain familiar cultural practices and daily routines. In doing so, civilians regained a sense of agency in a world that had been dominated by fear and uncertainty for years. The presence of soldiers, both American and Allied, was a constant reminder of the war's end and its immediate consequences. Townspeople witnessed the surrender of large numbers of German troops, the establishment of checkpoints, and the organization of logistical operations across their streets. While the scale of military activity was overwhelming, it also demonstrated the end of active combat in their immediate area. Civilians could see, hear, and understand that the tide of history had moved decisively, and that survival depended on careful observation and cooperation. As weeks passed, patterns emerged. Markets reopened, children cautiously returned to school, and some families resumed work in factories or farms under the oversight of Allied authorities. Daily life was no longer dictated solely by fear, but by adaptation to a new reality. Civilians navigated the tension between rebuilding routines and acknowledging the devastation that had occurred. Conversations often revolved around the war's end, stories of surrender, and the hope that this chaotic, sudden liberation would mark the beginning of recovery. The final days of the Third Reich were for civilians defined by contrasts. Streets that had once been silent under authoritarian control were now filled with the movement of soldiers, vehicles, and liberated populations. Fear existed alongside hope, uncertainty alongside cautious optimism. Families had to balance grief for those lost, relief for survival, and determination to move forward in a changed world. Every action, from retrieving supplies to speaking with soldiers, carried weight, and yet the adaptability and resilience of ordinary people allowed them to navigate this transition. In the end, the experiences of civilians amid the collapse of Nazi Germany were as important to history as the movements of armies. They witnessed surrender, occupation, and the dismantling of a regime in real time. They adapted, survived, and began the slow process of rebuilding lives that had been governed by fear and totalitarian control. The sudden arrival of Allied forces, the surrender of soldiers, and the collapse of German authority reshaped towns and families in profound ways. Ordinary people became witnesses to history, learning firsthand how quickly the world around them could be transformed. By May 1945, as the final surrender of German forces approached, towns across the former Reich reflected the extraordinary resilience of civilians. Streets that had been battlegrounds or pathways for fleeing troops were slowly returned to daily life. Markets reopened, schools resumed, and families rebuilt homes and communities. The occupation forces provided structure, but civilians' resourcefulness and adaptation determined how quickly life normalized. The collapse of Nazi Germany was not just a military event, it was a social and psychological transformation experienced directly by millions of ordinary people. For many, the memories of those final weeks, tanks appearing overnight, soldiers marching through streets, towns surrendering without a fight, and the daily adjustments to occupation would remain vivid for a lifetime. These experiences illustrated both the fragility of control and the resilience of ordinary citizens. The sudden, almost overnight collapse of the Nazi Germany forced civilians to confront fear, hope, and survival simultaneously. In these moments, they became living witnesses to history, navigating the complex and often contradictory realities of liberation, surrender, and the uncertain promise of peace.